Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you are safe and well in your part of the world. Welcome to the second webinar in our series of 3 for the assessment plan changes to the Operations Departmental Manager standard. So this session is going to look at the requirements in a bit more detail than we were able to do in webinar 1. And best practice for the new assessment methods. So before we get started, can I just check that you can hear me? And for those of you familiar with our webinars, either put your hand up, say yes in the questions box. Joe, can you see any of those questions?
Yeah, lots of yeses, and I can hear you, so it sounds like we're broadcasting nicely.
Yeah, that's always good to hear, because I have tried to do a webinar once where no one could hear me, so that's excellent news. So as is usual, because we've got quite a few of you on this webinar, you're all on mute, but this is an interactive session, so we've got places where we will pause for questions. So if you've got a question that pops into your head, pop it onto the chat, onto the questions, and we will try to get to those questions throughout the webinar. We do make a commitment to answer all of your questions. If we can't do it at the time, we are compiling what we call a frequently asked questions document, and we will get those out to you. Now, as this is a series of 3, we will, at the end of the series of 3, send all of the recordings, the slides, and a frequently asked questions document out to you. So you won't have received anything from us yet if you attended webinar 1. You will get them all after webinar 3, which, if my memory serves me right, is on the 14th of December. Crikey, December's running away with us already, isn't it? We are recording this along with the other 2, and so if you do need to hop off at any time, just wait for the recording and you'll get the full details. So what are we going to be looking at today? So this is really part of how we support you. We like to guide you through the process, so we're going to be talking about a little more detail around the new assessment plan, and also some guidance around some of the services that we've got available to help you. Helping you to help the learners pass first time is really important for all concerned, and hopefully some of the hints and tips that we provide for you today will help you to share with your learners. We have got a specialist team that support in specific areas, and we've got a few of us here today to help you with those, and they will pop up and introduce themselves to you throughout. But if you're familiar with our webinars, you'll have seen and heard from us all before. So I'm conscious that I haven't said who I am, and I'm Karen Egan, and I'm joined in the team by my colleague Jill Hanson. So we now have 2 technical advisors for the ILM portfolio, which of course covers the apprenticeship standards in management. So I'm delighted that we've got Jill in the team with us now. She's not with us today. I think she's probably listening in, but I'll take you through this morning. So what are we covering? So we'll do some introductions at the right time. Joe's going to take you through some background, and then Juicy will talk you through the new assessment plan, the requirements and how it works, along with the timelines. We're going to talk a little bit about EPA Pro, which is our new software that is dedicated to processing EPA documentation and bookings. We've actually moved that to the end of the webinar, so it's a bit out of kilter with the timeline there. And then we're going to look at best practice for the 2 assessment methods. So you'll see that there's 4 items there. The portfolio is not assessed, but we thought it was worth being very clear about what the requirements are, and then the professional discussion splits into 2 areas with project as well. So we'll cover those all separately. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Joe to take you through some of the background.
Thanks, Karen. And can I check, can you still hear me okay, Karen?
Yes, I've got you, Joe. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, good morning to everyone. My name is Joe Ballantyne. I'm the industry manager for ILM, which means I have the privileged position to manage the portfolio, and also the privileged position to have worked with the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education and the Trailblazer group, which includes employers and other endpoint assessment organisations, to develop this new assessment plan. And Karen, can I have the next slide? There we go, perfect. So for those of you that have attended webinar 1, which we held last week, but also the same set of webinars we held when we launched the team leader, you will have seen this slide before. But really just as a recap, and also for those who haven't joined us previously, as I've mentioned, we've been working consistently now with the employee group, other EPAOs and IFATE to develop this new assessment plan. And it's worth pointing out that this is very much a process that is managed by IFATE, because as we all know now that the Institute are the owners of the apprenticeship standards and the assessment plans, and so therefore the Institute managed that process. But we've very much been working very closely with them and feeding into the new assessment plan, which obviously we're going to go through in detail today. But the key things really just to point out, and you will certainly see this now when you compare the level 3 team leader supervisor and the level 5 operations departmental manager, that there is clear consistency and comparability between the 2, and that's been at the core of the reviews in ensuring that there is that consistency and comparability, not only across the standards but also across endpoint assessment organisations. As I'm sure we can all appreciate that with any version 1 there are often teething problems, and I think we have all experienced some of the pain with version 1, and a lot of that has been addressed with version 2, which obviously you will start to see. But there are other changes to the assessment plan that have been made to ensure that the assessment plan aligns with IFATE's policies, which of course evolve and are updated, and so therefore you'll start to see changes that are much more aligned to IFATE's up-to-date policy. But finally, but not least, it's really worth knowing that these new assessment plans have very much also been based upon feedback that the Institute have received from employers, from providers, from endpoint assessment organisations, and also from learners. And therefore that feedback has driven IFATE's decision making, not only regarding the assessment plan, but also in relation to policy. And so therefore, what you can see in this new assessment plan, as with the level 3 team leader, you will see that there are significant changes, but much more alignment. And in only a few months' time, we will be doing the same for the level 7 senior leader, because we're currently working on that. So that is due to be published early next year. So we'll be following on from this with the level 7, so lots more to come. But I would highly recommend listening to the entire webinar today. We've got some great speakers, and some fantastic information. So please do listen to the full webinar and also join us on the third webinar that we have next week. Lots of great information. And just to finish, we've had one question come in about something you mentioned earlier, Karen, about how we're sending the recordings. So just to quickly answer that, we will be sending all 3 of the recordings and all 3 of the presentation slides in one email. So you will get that all in one email. So you've got one source with all the information. And on that, I shall hand back to Karen.
Thanks, Joe. What we're going to do is ask you a question to start with, and just to sort of get an understanding about where you're at on your journey. So tell me, Joe, when you can see it.
Yeah, that's up there now.
Okay.
So the question reads, how confident are you in supporting your apprentices through the new assessment plan? And the options are very confident, quite confident, not very confident, not confident at all.
It was interesting. I'm going to let this run for a little bit. It was interesting that when it first started, it said 100% of people were very confident, and I thought, well, I'll just pack up and go home now then. If everyone was very confident, but clearly that's not the case as I'm looking at this.
I think that means that there's some very quick people who hit the very confident button first.
Very confident, very quick people that were there to begin with. So that's great. So
we're up to 79% now, Karen.
Okay, well, have we got just those last few people to add their thoughts? No, we seem to have stalled, don't we?
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay. So I'm going to share the results of that.
Yeah, we can see those now, Karen. That's brilliant.
Okay.
So we've got 7% saying very confident. There's some early sprinters there, so that's brilliant. Great to see 50%. So half of people attending are quite confident, which is brilliant. 40 not very confident, so they may have only just recently started to become aware of the assessment plan changes, and 3% not confident at all. So they were obviously very new to the changes. So
okay.
An interesting.
Great. That's great. Okay, well, thank you for that, Joe. And you know, hopefully we can through this webinar shift you sort of further to be more confident. But we are here throughout to support and help you. So you know, we don't just sort of run this webinar and run away. We're here to support you all the way. So hopefully we can get you into that very confident category. But if you're anything like me, you're not going to be 100% confident until you've actually done one. I have to do something to feel confident with it. So what we're going to do now is hand you over to Juicy, who is going to take you through more detail around the assessment plan. Are you there, Juicy?
Yes, thank you, Karen. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, thank you.
Right, thank you. Good morning to everyone. My name is Giusy Poliseno, and I'm the Development Manager looking after the apprenticeship for Level 3 and Level 5 in particular. So I would like to tell you a bit more about how the endpoint assessment for this apprenticeship has now changed following the changes of the recently published assessment plan. It was published, I think, around end of October, which has significantly changed from the previous assessment plan. So if we can start to look at one of the first assessment methods, we start with the professional discussion, which is underpinned by a portfolio of evidence. The reference number for this component is 9309, 705 for the first sitting, and 755 in case of a receipt or retake. So first of all, it's important to note that the knowledge, skills and behaviors within the standard have been distributed into different KSB groups, and each assessment method will assess the different KSB groups. So the knowledge, skills and behavior groups assessed in this assessment method are the following: operational planning and management, managing teams, communication skills, personal and professional development. Now let's talk about the portfolio of evidence, which I still want to emphasize. It represents still an important piece of work, piece of evidence for the endpoint assessment. So first of all, the portfolio needs to be a completed portfolio of evidence that is submitted at Gateway. The portfolio is not directly assessed, but it underpins the professional discussion, so it informs the professional discussion. So the IEPer, the independent endpoint assessor, once they receive the portfolio of evidence, they will review the content and base the questions, the topics, the areas for discussion within the professional discussion based on the content seen in the portfolio of evidence. So it's very important for the apprentice to be familiar with the content and base their answers during the professional discussion and making links to the evidence submitted, because as we said, the portfolio is not assessed, it's rather the answers given by the apprentice during the professional discussion that are assessed. And it's important to note that both the IEPers and the apprentice will have the portfolio of evidence with them during the professional discussion so that they can refer to it. Another requirement is that the portfolio of evidence must be accompanied by a mapping document. It's what we called portfolio of evidence matrix that must clearly shows how the evidence is mapped against the relevant knowledge, skills and behaviors that are assessed as part of this assessment method. It's important to note that the portfolio of evidence matrix need to be completed in full. So if, for instance, we receive a portfolio of evidence matrix that has got some gaps that where knowledge, skills and behaviors have not been referenced, or for instance, they've been referenced, but the portfolio actually doesn't include the evidence that was listed in the matrix, what will happen is that the portfolio will be returned. The apprentice will need to revise the portfolio of evidence matrix and the portfolio itself and then resubmit it. Now, in this case, it might be that in exceptional circumstances, the EPA event day might change to accommodate the resubmission, the review and resubmission of the portfolio matrix by the apprentice, and also give enough time to the IEPer to review the content of the final submission prior to the professional discussion. So it's really important to have a completed portfolio of evidence matrix and a complete portfolio of evidence. Another requirement is that the portfolio of evidence should not include any reflective accounts or any method of self-assessment. This is with the exception of skills 8.1, which is the module self-awareness, able to reflect on own performance, working style, and its impact on others. So this is the only exception. And I just wanted to make a point that you will see in many assessment plans where they have a portfolio that actually IF8 doesn't consider a reflective account or a self-assessment a valid piece of evidence to be included as part of the portfolio. So this is not just for the level 5 or for the level 3, but is now a common theme and guidance that comes from IF8. obviously, as we said, with the exception of skill 8.1. Now, we will also expect the portfolio to contain all the evidence against the MAP knowledge skill, all the MAP knowledge skills and behaviors that are assessed within this assessment method. Obviously, it's important that each piece of evidence covers as many criteria as possible to be holistic in its nature. That's how we call it, holistic nature, because of course we have a restriction in terms of the size of this portfolio. The recommendation is that it should be typically 20 pieces of evidence. Now, if we receive the portfolio and there is a lot more evidence included outside of these 20 pieces, it could be then the portfolio will be returned because the evidence is deemed being excessive. Therefore, the apprentice will need to revise the portfolio evidence and then resubmit it. And then again, in this case, in exceptional circumstances, it might mean that the EPA event day will need to be moved to accommodate the resubmission, the reviewing of the apprentice portfolio, and also allow again the IEPers to see the final evidence that has been submitted as part of the portfolio. In terms of the duration of the professional discussion, it's a total of 60 minutes. And within 60 minutes, there is an additional 10% that is at the discretion of the independent endpoint assessor to increase it by 10%, by up to 10%, to allow the apprentice to complete the last answer. Within these 60 minutes, there is a minimum of 6 competency-based questions that will be asked to prompt the discussion to start with. It is likely that further questions will be asked for clarification purposes and to allow the apprentice the opportunity to cover the knowledge, skills, behaviors mapped to this assessment method, as well as the grading descriptors, which I will tell you a bit more later on. Now, if we can move to the next slide. We mentioned in the previous slide about 20 pieces of evidence. So it's typically 20 pieces of evidence as stated in the assessment plan. So we start to see straight away how important is the quality. It has to be the quality of the evidence over the quantity of the evidence. So we said holistic evidence, where one piece of evidence can cover multiple criteria. So a qualitative approach, rather a quantitative approach, where actually the evidence selected represent their best piece of evidence against the knowledge, skills and behaviors and grading descriptors mapped to the assessment method. The assessment plan also gives some guidance about the evidence sources that may be included within the portfolio of evidence. It's important to note that this is not an exhaustive list, so there is a lot more that you can include, but it's just to give you some guidance and recommendation. So first of all, it could be evidence based on workplace documentation, records, for example, workplace policies and procedures. We also recommend the submission of a personal development plan, which is highly recommended. The reason why is because within the professional discussion, there are some grading descriptors that relate to the creation of a personal development plan. Of course, if the personal development plan is not there, then we will need to question the apprentice about how they created this PDP. So if instead is there, then actually we can talk about the knowledge, skills and behaviors that led them to the creation of this personal development plan. We obviously know that time is tight, so that's why it's so important that the portfolio is a completed portfolio of evidence, so that apprentice can really focus on covering as much as they can in full the grading descriptors that are mapped to these knowledge, skills and behaviors. You can also include witness statements. And when including witness statement, it's so important that they are based on direct observation. So for instance, what the employer training provider have seen, not based purely on an opinion, but based on a direct observation. When you are submitting a witness testimony, just to give you some best practice guidance, it should be clear the relationship of the witness with the apprentice. The witness should include their name and job title. The evidence must have been generated on program, specifically for this apprenticeship. The approximate date when the evidence was observed, and obviously very clear examples of direct observation where the apprentice has demonstrated competency against the standard whilst being on program. For any group activity, it's important to make clear what was the contribution of the apprentice. So work activity, work evidence is accepted as long as it's very clear what was the contribution of the apprentice towards that piece of evidence to demonstrate that they have the knowledge, skills and behaviors required. You can also add annotated photographs and video clips. In terms of video clips, the assessment plan states that the maximum total duration should be 20 minutes, where the apprentice must be identifiable, so in view. So this is all to ensure that valid evidence is submitted and is attributable to the apprentice, and the employers need to make sure a statement is provided by the employer and the apprentice confirming this. Another point I just wanted to make very quickly is about the format of the evidence. It's so important that the evidence included is accessible to the IEPer, the independent endpoint assessor. We had cases in the past where evidence cannot be opened by the IEPer. For instance, that could be evidence that is linked, for instance, to an e-portfolio or embedded within a document. So if the evidence cannot be opened again, the portfolio will be returned, and the apprentice will need to revise the evidence, make sure it's accessible, and then resubmit it to the IEPer. And again, in exceptional circumstances, this might mean that the EPA event day for the professional discussion will need to be moved to allow the apprentice to revise and the IEPer to actually access all the evidence that has been submitted as part of the portfolio. So if we can now move to the next slide, I want to tell you a bit more about the second method of assessment, which is the project proposal presentation with questioning, which is the 9309, 704, again for the first sitting, and 754 in case of a resit or retake. As for the previous assessment method, the knowledge, skills and behaviors have been distributed into KSB groups, and the groups assessed by this method are planning their project proposal, delivery of their project proposal, and project proposal output. This assessment method is made of two components, which are assessed holistically together. One is the project proposal, which is based on a post-gateway work. And then we got the last part, which is the presentation with the questioning. In terms of the project proposal, subject, title, and scope, there are some examples of titles and scope that can be covered by the proposal, which are listed in the assessment plan. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, and I will tell you a bit more in the next slide, but it could be, for instance, linked to the need to review and implement a change plan to improve efficiency in the workplace. It could be related to continuous improvement review of a current process or a service or a product to ensure it's still fit for purpose and it meets the needs of the business, current needs of the business. Or it could be about the need to implement a direct saving across their team, department, or organization following a reforecast activity. So if we can move to the next slide, I will tell you a bit more about the subject, title, and scope of this project proposal, which first of all will need to be agreed between the employer and us at Gateway. The way it will work is that we will provide you with the template for the brief summary that again needs to be submitted at Gateway. Now, the brief summary is not assessed and it shouldn't be more than 500 words. Again, this is stated in the assessment plan, so we just didn't come up with these rules. It is detailed in the assessment plan. This brief summary should demonstrate how the project proposal will meet the need of the business, should show how the project proposal will be relevant to the apprentice role, and it will need to give sufficient opportunity for the relevant KSBs to be covered and assessed at EPA stage. In terms of the structure of this brief summary, the assessment plan states that the brief summary should include, first of all, an overview of the apprentice role as an operational departmental manager in relation to the project, an outline of the project purpose, of the project purpose. It needs to include the real business benefit that is anticipated as a result of the implementation of the project, and roughly the length of the project, so start date and anticipated end date. Once received, the IEPER will review the brief summary and decide whether to accept it and reject it. Again, is purely based in the decision on the information and providing and establishing whether there is enough scope opportunity for the apprentice to demonstrate the knowledge, skills, and behaviors and grading descriptors which are mapped to this method. So if we reject it, is only to allow the apprentice to either review the brief summary, whether to include more information or whether to think about a different project proposal. So once it is accepted, the apprentice will have 12 weeks to write and submit project proposal together with a presentation document, which I will tell you more later on. This project proposal needs to be a detailed project implementation proposal that does not need to be fully implemented. The only actual bits that need to be fully implemented at EPA stage are related to the skills 1.2, 2.1, 2.2, and 3.1. These skills are related to the support, management, and communication of change by identifying barriers and overcoming them, planning, organization, and management of resources to deliver the required outcomes, the monitoring of the progress, and any identification of risks and mitigations, and the monitoring of budgets, provision of reports, and the consideration of financial implications of decisions, and any adjustment to the approach recommendation. So if we now move to the next slide, which is about the project proposal itself. Again, the assessment plan is very specific and gives a lot of guidance about the content of this proposal. It must be a 4,000 words document, plus minus 10%, which is at the apprentice discretion, including tables, graphs, and figures, and excluding references and annexes from the 4,000 words count. It also needs to include a mapping document in addition to the word count, which must show how the evidence within the proposal maps to the relevant knowledge, skills, and behaviors and grading descriptors assessed as part of this assessment method. The assessment plan gives actually a very thorough and detailed structure about this document, and is really to ensure is robust and sufficiently covers the mapped knowledge, skills, and behaviors. So we should see an executive summary, an introduction, the scope of the proposed project, including the KPIs, the objectives, the project plan, including Gantt charts, risk issue mitigation, RACI metrics, how the proposed project outcomes will be achieved, any comment on the validity of the methods of analysis, data interpretation, and how the data presentation was used, financial budgeting and resources, proposed implementation plan, including communication with stakeholders and the relevant plans, thinking about whether any alternative approach have been considered, whether there could be, for instance, a more cost or time efficient manner to approach the project, and finally, any recommendation and conclusions. So you can see there is a definitive list of what it must include. Once, as I said, it needs to be submitted, and you got 12 weeks to work on it from the time the brief summary is accepted, and it will need to be submitted together with the presentation. So now I can tell you a bit more about the presentation in the next slide. So the presentation and questioning, as we said, is the second component. So first of all, we had the project proposal, and then we have the presentation with questioning. And please bear in mind that, as we said, they are assessed holistically together. So the grading is derived by looking at the project proposal and the presentation and the questions. So the presentation must be submitted together with the project, and it will focus on the project implementation proposal. Again, there is a definitive list of what the presentation will need to cover, and it's based on the modules which are within the standard. So we have operational management, first of all, which is about business tools, the management of systems, the identification and overcoming barriers, the identification of opportunities, and the interpretation of data. Then it must cover project management, the use of tools and techniques to plan and deliver the outcomes, and the approaches to the identification and management of risks. It should cover finance, therefore the monitoring of budgets and any financial implications, leading people while supporting the management of change, together with building relationship, communication skills, management of self, so how activities are prioritized, and therefore time management, decision making, so using evaluation techniques to support the process, and finally progress of the implementation of the project proposal today. So these are, you will be familiar with these modules. They are the body of the standard. So once the presentation will be submitted, the apprentice will be given 2 weeks notice prior to the EPA event for the presentation. So the apprentice can review both the project proposal and presentation, and at the same time the IEPer, the independent endpoint assessor, will review the content of these documents and prepare the questions accordingly based on the content seen. So if you can please move to the next slide. Let's talk about the timing and the setting of the presentation itself. So overall, the presentation with the questioning will last a maximum of 60 minutes. However, the IEPer will have the discretion to increase the time by up to 10% to allow the apprentice to cover, to complete their last answer. In terms of distribution of the time, typically we have 20 minutes on the presentation and 40 minutes with the questioning. The IEPer can actually allocate the 10%, the 10% increase in any proportion across the presentation and the questioning. There will be, after the presentation, the questioning session, where the IEPer will ask a minimum of 9 questions, 1 question each for each of the themes that I mentioned in the previous slide. It is expected that after these 9 questions, there will be also follow-up questions. What is the purpose of questions? It's really to seek clarification on the proposal and/or presentation, and to assess the depth and breadth of the knowledge, skills, and behaviors, and to assess those KSPs that perhaps the apprentice did not have the opportunity to demonstrate within the proposal, although these should be kept to a minimum. Okay, so if we can move to the next session. So we, opposite to the other assessment plan, where we didn't have a grading descriptor, we are very lucky with this assessment plan, which is a lot more defined. We have pass and grading descriptors, and it's a very robust and rigid at the same time assessment method, where we require, following the assessment plan, of course, that in order to achieve a pass, all pass descriptors need to be met 100%, and in order to achieve a distinction, all the passes and all the distinctions will need to be met. So you can see straight away the difference between the previous assessment plan, where actually the requirement was 50% to pass, where here it's 100%. It's important to note that we do have grading descriptors that are mapped to the knowledge, skills, and behaviors. These knowledge, skills, and behaviors, as I said, they've been divided in KSB groups. So you can see how you will be able to see how each knowledge, skills, and behavior groups is measured and assessed by looking at the grading descriptors, which will actually show you the knowledge, skills and behaviors contained within each descriptors. Okay, so I think there was quite a lot of information that I provided you with. So I just wanted to break for a moment and to see if we have any questions related to the content that I just covered. Joe, have we got any questions?
We do have quite a few questions, Juicy. Okay, so just to start with, we're not going to be able to get through all of the questions today. So just to repeat what Karen mentioned at the start, that we will commit to answering all of the questions, and we'll be sharing the frequently asked question document. So please be assured that if we don't answer it today, we will include it in our FAQ document. But to start us off, Juicy, there's a few questions around reflective accounts. So I wonder if you could maybe just give another reflection as to kind of why reflective accounts are no longer permitted.
Yes, sure. As I mentioned, this is coming from the Institute for Apprenticeship and Technical Education Guidance. So opposite from the past, where there were endpoint assessment with portfolio that were accepting reflective accounts, IF8 doesn't think that they are valid piece of evidence, and they need really to be backed up by product evidence. So there is an exception. As I said, we will accept reflective accounts and method of self-assessment for skill 8.1, which is the module within the standard self-awareness, which of course is about the reflection, the ability to reflect on performance, working style, and its impact on others. But I will say that the main reason overall it was because one thing is about the apprentice, to write something where they reflect on how good they've been. But of course, it really needs to be backed up by product evidence that really shows how they have demonstrated with real work the relevant knowledge, skills, and behaviors. So this is the main reason, I will say. I hope I answer it in full, but I don't know if maybe Karen, you want to add a bit more, or if you think is enough.
I think Juicy, that's very clear, and I think I often use an example about that I could say, well, I'm a brilliant chef. And I could talk to you about all the lovely recipes that I've created and how people loved them. And, so it's a reflective account or maybe in a professional discussion. But where's that evidence? Where is that evidence that I have created these recipes, that people have found them to be fabulous? And I suppose the same applies in this context of the management standards. We need to have that evidence that what they're saying is accurate and there is evidence to support it. So so that's all I would add. I love a little example that's totally away from management, so I don't know if that helps at all.
Well, we all like baking, so.
I'm all inside out though, I have to say. I've made too many mince pies this weekend.
Well, hopefully this time next year we'll be able to do some face-to-face events and we can have some of those mince pies, Karen.
Fingers crossed.
Wonderful. Well, I think that's a good answer. So thank you both for that. Okay, another question here, just to pick up. If the portfolio of evidence has to be returned because there's missing evidence or anything around what you shared, Juicy, does this affect the learner getting a distinction?
No, it doesn't. So it's not a fail. It's just if I gave two examples. So if the EPA team, the endpoint assessment team, will receive an incomplete mapping document, for instance. So obviously you will have all the boxes for knowledge, skills, and behaviors, for instance, assessed via the professional discussion underpinned by the portfolio. If there are any blanks that are supposed to be there, or for instance, if they are listed there but they are not in the portfolio, will be returned and you will be asked to, apprentices will be asked to revise it. But this is not gonna have any impact in terms of grading, but of course you just need to make sure that it doesn't have an impact, a delay in terms of the EPA event, which I believe is planned during the planning meeting. So that is to take into consideration, but no, it doesn't affect grading, definitely not.
Wonderful. I think that's very clear. Thank you, Juicy. I can see that there's a lot of questions here around different scenarios regarding product evidence. So I think just to say to those questions that we have picked up on a number of scenarios in relation to the portfolio and combinations of different evidence. So that will be in the FAQs, and we're also working on some exemplar materials. So we will come back to those. Some good questions, but quite a few of them. So it's probably worth trying to give guidance in one go. But just to pick up on one question here, which I think is worth reflecting on. But there's a question around if reflective accounts are not allowed, what is an acceptable method as an alternative? Can a professional discussion be a suitable alternative to reflective account, whereby a professional discussion, as we know, is led by an assessor? So would you be able to share your thoughts on that, Juicy, Karen?
I'm happy to start, and if Juicy wants to add anything. I think a professional discussion is fine, provided there is the product evidence to back it up. You know, this is, I'll be covering this later in the webinar around our best practice, but you need to have, you know, so if there's a professional discussion, the learner needs to be able to say, well, you know, for example, I chaired a meeting and here's the agenda, here's what I did, you know, and here's the evidence, here's a witness testimony. It all needs to wrap up together, and that's what we need to be able to see, that it's not just the learner saying how brilliant they are, where is the evidence that supports it? So, you know, that's what you really need to focus on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karen. So lots of questions around the portfolio. So I'm just going to fast track and just pick up the last couple of questions that relate to some of the other assessment methods. Okay, so here's one question. Karen, you might want to reflect on this a little. So is a project still needed as part of the portfolio of evidence? In other words, will they have to do 2 projects?
Well, project management is part of the on-programme learning. So that, because the standard, the knowledge, skills and behaviours have not changed. Okay, so they will still need to do, you know, to cover all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours. And of course, we know that project management is part of that. However, what has shifted is that there would the current assessment plan, they do a project in the last 6 months, whereas IFATE have very clearly, and I know, Joe, you had a lot of conversations with IFATE about that, but the project has to be, you know, suggested and be proposed, and the implementation begun post gateway. But the knowledge, skills and behaviours, which includes project management, still need to be fully covered so that they're gateway ready.
Yeah, I think that's a really clear answer, Karen, and you're absolutely right. I think it's really important that we understand that obviously the endpoint assessment is very separate to the on-program, which is why you will see in all endpoint assessment plans that evidence has to be completed post-gateway. And so therefore you do have that very clear focus for the on-program delivery of teaching and learning for that apprentice to really gain those skills and that knowledge and those behaviours, and that obviously then that is assessed at endpoint assessment. So it's very important to have that clear in our minds. So I'm just
Can I just add something, Joe?
Yes, absolutely.
Just to clarify, so project management is assessed within the project proposal and presentation with questioning. It is not assessed within the portfolio. So it's just, as I said, the KSB have been divided. They've been divided, so there is no repetition across the two methods. So project management must be demonstrated within the project proposal and presentation questioning.
Yeah, but it's also done. It's part of the on-program learning, so they will, I'm sure, gather evidence that they are gateway ready, and that's the key sort of thing, really. So,
yeah. So my answer was related to the EPA piece, not to the on-program.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I'm conscious of time because we're kind of 55 minutes in. So have you got one more question?
There's lots of questions, so I think let's dive back into the presentation and we can pick back up on questions at our next pit stop.
Okay, we're back with Juicy, aren't we, for a couple of slides?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk now about timeline. So the assessment plan is very specific when things need to happen and how long apprentices will have. First of all, at Gateway, there will be two requirements. First of all, they will need to submit a completed portfolio of evidence, and then they will need to submit the brief summary about the scope of the project proposal. So two requirements, two documents to be sent at Gateway. Once they are received, then you will hear back about the apprentice brief summary, whether it's accepted or rejected within 5 days. So at the end of 5 days, you will hear back one way or the other. Once accepted, finally accepted, then the apprentice will have 12 weeks to work on the project proposal and presentation. So it's important to note again, it's all post-gateway work. So the evidence included cannot be pre-gateway, it's all post-gateway. So they have 12 weeks time to write and then submit both the project proposal, implementation plan, and the presentation at the same time. From that point on, then the apprentice will be given 2 weeks notice ahead of the presentation day. So the apprentice will have time to review the project proposal and presentation documents, and at the same time the IEPer will have 2 weeks to review the content and prepare the questions accordingly. And not only that, also starting to take some decision perhaps on grading, because we said it's holistic grading, so everything counts in this case. Content on the proposal, content of the presentation itself, so there might be gaps and there might be gaps and also areas that need clarification that will be done through the questioning. So the questions will be tailored to fit the content seen within the project and presentation documents. Now let's talk instead about the receipts in the next slide. There is now an important difference that we will be audited. So awarding bodies will be audited and will need to provide information about apprentices receipting or retaking. So once the apprentice will receive the feedback in case they have failed, the apprentice, employer and provider will need to decide whether receipt or a retake is necessary. Now, there is a clear difference that is explained in the assessment plan between a receipt and a retake. First of all, receipt. A receipt is when no additional activity is required, while any additional learning activity, while a retake requires additional learning to take place. So you will need to establish whether the fail is due to a receipt or a retake. And then you will need to let us know whether you want to do a receipt or a retake. And I think that communication will happen through EPA Pro, which my colleague Maurice will tell you a bit more. Now, if it is a receipt that is needed, the expectation is that from the time you are notified of the failed feedback, the apprentice will need to receipt within 3 months and complete the endpoint assessment. If instead a retake is required, additional learning will need to take place, then you will notify us when you are ready. And so from the time you have been notified of the failed feedback, within 6 months, a retake will need to take place. Now we have a bit more guidance and restriction on the project implementation proposal and presentation in terms of timing, in case there is a receipt or a retake. So from the time that you receive your fail feedback and establish whether a receipt or a retake is required. Once that is established, in any case, the apprentice will have 3 weeks to rework on the project proposal and presentation and resubmit. So that 3 weeks is purely working on the project proposal and presentation and then resubmit it. So obviously, whether it is a retake, the additional learning will take place prior to that. So as I said in the previous slide, you will need to notify us once you are ready for EPA, and we will give you 3 weeks to work on the documentation. Submit it, and then this will be given 2 weeks notice to prepare for the presentation. And at the same time, so they can revise, and our IEPer, the independent endpoint assessor, will review the final project proposal and presentation and prepare the questions accordingly. And also, as I said, start to make decision on grading based on the revised content. So this is the timeline. And so, do we have any questions, Joe?
Yeah, Joe, if we can keep 2 questions on the timeline, very conscious of time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I've scrolled straight down to the bottom. Okay, so a question here. Can a learner use an old project that's 12 to 18 months old, or a current project that they are working on, as part of their evidence for EPA? Absolutely
not, no. But that's very, very clear in the assessment plan.
I like your answer, Karen.
Sorry,
definitely. Post-gateway work, definitely.
Yeah.
It needs to happen post gateway, so absolutely not.
And you have to consider, if you've got a project that someone has implemented 18 months ago, was an apprenticeship a suitable learning tool for that person if they were already competent in project management? That's just a question that's in my head. You know, no doubt, you know, if right at the beginning of their apprenticeship they were competent in that field, then you know that should have been considered right at the beginning of the apprenticeship about whether that was prior learning that they didn't need.
Absolutely, and I think that talks to the point around making sure that you do skill scans, etc., right at the start, then also before they reach gateway. So another question here that I think is worth just reflecting on: if a learner fails, why would they just resit? Surely extra work is needed. So the question is, who decides on whether it should be a resit or a retake?
It's the employer, apprentice and training provider that need to let us know whether additional learning is required. And this is a requirement of IF8. Awarding bodies will be audited on how many apprentices have had to resit or how many had to retake. So it's up to apprentice, employer and provider to decide and let us know.
And it could just be that the individual had you know, their presentation skills weren't particularly good, or they were very nervous and they didn't fully answer questions. So it might have just been the assessment method that became the barrier for them. And that would be an example of when maybe just a pure resit would be required rather than some additional learning.
Great, thank you both. Probably a question for you, Karen. So there's a question here reflecting on the ILM Level 5 workbooks that are available. Are they still recommended to use as to cover the underpinning knowledge? So are they still relevant?
They are designed as learning workbooks. And obviously then if they've completed those with evidence, then they're absolutely fine to use. But please don't just upload them into the portfolio. You know, you just need to be very selective about which parts you actually choose, or very carefully cross-reference very specifically where in the workbook the evidence can be found. So you know, you just need to think about what is required in the portfolio of evidence.
Absolutely, and it's worth just reflecting and say that the actual apprenticeship standard, the actual requirements have not changed. It's the assessment method that has changed.
I guess the question is really reflecting on what evidence that we've already gathered can we use for the portfolio. And yes, and I think just be mindful about how you gather it in the first place and the product evidence that you gather alongside it.
Thank you, Karen. Okay, so so some area of clarity needed here. So do they need to evidence the full project cycle at the endpoint assessment? So do they have to complete the full project cycle at the endpoint assessment?
The project proposal, there needs to be an implementation plan, and it needs to be sufficiently implemented to cover some of the skills. I can't remember which slide it was, but we've covered that on one of the previous slides. There are certain skills that they need to be able to demonstrate they have done during the project. So it doesn't need to be fully implemented, but it needs to be partially implemented.
Correct. They are listed S12, S21, S22, and S31, which I mentioned. So, but if you will need more details through the questions, we can provide you with the answers. I'm just bit conscious about time now, and we have quite a few slides to cover.
I was going to say the few questions here probably connect to what Maurice is going to cover in the next slide. So I think let's move on with the slides.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to be quick, hopefully. So we're looking now at sort of getting things right first time. Juicy has provided you with a whole lot of information there. So I'm just going to top that up with some thoughts around how you can get it right first time with your learners. So we're going to look at the portfolio of evidence to start with. And you may be wondering, why are they labouring the point here? Because it's no longer assessed. However, it underpins the professional discussion. And the better the quality of that portfolio, the better that the learner can draw on those aspects of their portfolio when they're having their professional discussion. So it's really important that is spot on. We do reject them if they don't meet the requirements, and really that's helping the learner to prepare and get it right, so that they're not sort of fumbling around trying to find evidence when they're actually having their professional discussion. So, what is a definition of a portfolio of evidence? Well, ours is a concise collection of apprentices' best pieces of evidence. The IEPA uses this to familiarise themselves with the apprentices' work and prepare for the professional discussion, as I've outlined there. So, some suggested ways forward, really. Use the evidence matrix, the mapping document. We do provide one, and that would be great if you use it. If you want to develop your own, as long as it's very clear how the evidence maps, then that's absolutely fine for you to use your own. But you need to make sure there are no gaps. Have you got a box on the matrix that's got nothing in it? That suggests very clearly that either you've forgotten to reference it, or that there is nothing in there, that you haven't got it. Ideally, we only need one piece of evidence mapped to the criterion. So if you've got 4 or 5, take a good hard look at it and remove some of those pieces. If you take a piece out and you think, well, it still covers the criteria, there's no need for it to be in there. So just have a really hard look at what's in there. Only include relevant knowledge, skills and behaviours. We don't need all of that background information or the nice to have information. It's just about what have we got here that meets the KSBs. If you've got a fairly large document, say, quite a number of pages, please direct the IEPA on that matrix document. Give them a page number, give them a paragraph, so that they can go straight to it to determine whether they where they can straight look to it. Don't give them a 20-page document to wade through to try and find it. And an issue that we have come up time and time again, people get to the endpoint assessment, and a lot of their evidence they're saying they can't produce for endpoint assessment because it's confidential. You need to be having that conversation right at the beginning of the apprenticeship, and make sure that as you're building your evidence, that it can be redacted and still be meaningful, or that it's not confidential. And I know that, we've had people who work in HR and the Ministry of Defence who have very successfully managed to pull together a portfolio that is meaningful, meets the requirements, and doesn't breach any GDPR or confidentiality. So do start thinking about that as your learner embarks on the apprenticeship, not at Gateway. So some general guidance around this, look at things holistically. It's the application of the knowledge learnt and the skills that they've acquired and how they demonstrate their behaviours. It needs to be their independent work rather than group work. And so, you know, they need to be looking at how in their everyday work they're covering, probably in one piece of work, a range of the knowledge, skills and behaviours that are required for this part of the portfolio, this part of the EPA. Okay, so make sure it's contextualised. It allows them to demonstrate the role that they've played. You know, if it's got to be very clear that the learner, the apprentice, has demonstrated the KSBs, and it helps them to move that forward. It needs to be authenticated, and as we've already said, should not include reflective accounts and self-evaluation, with that particular exception that Juicy's already gone into. So some tips here, a little bit repetitive, but it's worth stressing. Only include evidence that's relevant. A witness testimony can be a great piece of evidence. You can get it to cover several, if not all of the areas. I was talking to an IEPA about a witness testimony that actually had been written over time throughout. It was the apprentice's line manager who had just written a witness account of over time of how that learner had progressed and what they'd observed in that particular learner. So maybe a great piece of using one witness testimony very wisely. Use the evidence matrix, as I've already said, so that helps you to identify any gaps. You know, consider recording one professional discussion or include one assignment to cover all of the knowledge. But again, we need to, if it's knowledge, that's fine. If it's skills, you need to have the product evidence to support it. And please, if you've got evidence of a learner chairing 6 team meetings, just pick the best one. We only need to hit that criteria once. And the assessment plan by IFA clearly stipulates that audio and video files should be limited to less than 60 minutes, and they should be time-stamped. So it's clear on the matrix at which particular point that particular criteria is being met. And just have a listen to them before you submit them to make sure that they are very clear, because we have had a lot of occasions where the IEPA just cannot hear what is happening. So do just double check that before submitting. So 20 pieces of evidence, that's a hot topic, isn't it? What does 20 pieces of evidence look like? So we are happy to receive a small bundle of documents that would class as one piece of evidence. Okay. I always use this, apologies for being boring, but if a learner chairs a team meeting, they could have a short video of them chairing that meeting, a witness statement that refers to the meeting, the agenda and the notes, the action points or the minutes of the meeting could form a bundle. So what we've got there is 4 documents that would form one piece of evidence. So those documents are clearly in that example relating to each other. So they need to do that. So you can't have a random selection of 4 or 5 documents and call that a bundle. We need to then have that documents that relate to each other, that relate to one particular piece of evidence, and then use that, wring it dry, use that evidence across multiple areas, so that, you know, that's reinforcing that holistic approach. So a team chairing a team meeting could incorporate certainly communication skills, certainly managing people, leading people, maybe some aspects of project management as well. So use that piece of evidence multiple times. And just to kind of emphasize, you only need to submit that piece of evidence once, but then cross-reference it in the matrix. You don't need to keep putting it in and give it different reference numbers, just put it in once. We did have one the other day that looked as if it was an enormous portfolio, but in reality it was quite concise, but every time a piece of evidence was used, it was repeated. So just make sure when you're submitting pieces that they're valid and relevant. This is a well-known assessment method, and whilst I appreciate it's not assessed, it's the conversation that follows the professional discussion that is assessed. So to help the learner make sure that it's all valid and relevant, it's authentic, it's current, and it's sufficient. I won't go into the details. I'm going to pause very quickly for questions. One, maybe two key questions, Joe.
Yes, no problem. I was going to say lots of questions around portfolio, which we'll pick up on in the FAQs. Okay, yeah. So just the first question that's come through. So, so did I hear Karen say that a PD should be no more than 60 minutes? So I wonder whether you just recap what you mentioned there around the duration of a professional discussion.
No, I think maybe with the 60 minutes for audio files, is that
it
maybe?
May have been, yes.
Yeah.
So
wonder if it's that. Okay. Do you have one more? We've got 9 minutes left, Joe. Eek.
Well, I think looking at the questions here, there's a lot of these that are very similar. So I think for purposes of time, let's carry on with the presentation, and we will commit to answering all of these questions. But certainly thank you to everybody for asking lots of questions. There's lots of similar questions, so we will bring those together and add those to the FAQs and share that with the recordings and presentation.
Thanks, Joe. Right, okay. So we're looking now at the project implementation plan. So that's all very new stuff. So it's assessed holistically alongside the presentation with the questioning. So you need to make a decision here about, you know, how you're going to compile this project implementation plan. Are you going to look at making sure that project implementation plan covers all of the past criteria and all of the distinction criteria, so that you're making your presentation aspect a little bit simpler, or just able to recap? Are you just going to focus on all the past criteria, or maybe, you know, just cover some aspects of it? You've just got to make a decision, but know exactly where you're covering each of the criteria required, so you know exactly what you need to do for the presentation. They use that mapping document that's required to make sure you're very clear about what you're covering when. Okay, understand clearly where there are weaknesses in the plan so that you can cover it completely in the presentation. You only have 4,000 words. That might seem like quite a big amount, but actually it's not. It's probably 10 pages, maybe a bit more with some graphs, but use them concisely, use them wisely. You only have a leeway of 10%, so 4,400 words is your tops. There's no template, but use the headings, you know, and understand precisely what the criteria is requiring. It's looking at planning, it's looking at delivery, and it's looking at the output. So be clear about what you're doing in each part of the project plan. So the professional discussion, which follows on from the presentation. So good practice for preparing for the endpoint assessment is absolutely practice, practice, practice. If you can get them practicing professional discussions on programme, it will help them. Put them in front of a different tutor instead of you, to help them to actually calm those nerves during the EPA itself. The questions will require competency-based answers. So apprentices should respond with examples of how they've carried out tasks. They need to use the word I, not we, or be clear about their role within that piece of work. The apprentice needs to be clear on the purpose of the professional discussion. So they need to go into that professional discussion or the questioning section and be clear about what they need to tell the IEPA. Be clear about what is required. So make sure they're familiar with the technology as well. I don't think there's anyone in the world now, certainly in the business world, that can't use this type of technology, but we do them all remotely. So do have a look at that, and make sure that the learner has been having feedback constantly throughout their learner journey, so that they understand clearly how they're coming across in these situations. I am going to really rattle on with this because I'm cutting Maurice down to the wire here. So think about answering questions concisely. Do use a model so that you answer the question fully. There's a lot for the learner for the IEPA to get through. So if the learner is as concise as possible and answering the question fully first time, then it means that the IEPA doesn't have to do lots of follow-up questions. So this is a model that I quite like, covering, explain what the situation was, the task that was undertaken, what actions were taken, the results, and the reflection on how it went is a great way to actually go through that. So I've got an example here. I will leave you to look at that once we've issued the presentations. But some areas of good performance that IEPAs have shared with us is that apprentices have their portfolio ready and are organised and referenced. They know where their stuff is. Make sure they've got their photographic ID ready. Without that, the EPA cannot go ahead. They need to be able to clearly identify themselves. Apprentices who have undertaken guided practice prior to the EPA do perform well, linking the KSBs to the experience within the workplace always gets good results. That they've practiced about professional discussions in advance, that shows very clearly during the EPA. And that, we have had learners who turn up on screen and think it's just going to be a little chat, and they're not really prepared. So, and it's just not helpful in helping them to gain a pass. I'm going to look at presentations now. Again, practice, practice, practice. Please don't let the first time that they deliver this presentation be the first time that the first time they deliver it to the IEPA to be the first time that they've actually done it. In preparing these presentations for you, prepare in front of our other halves, the dog, the cat, in just making sure that we clearly understand what's going through. Again, know what's being assessed, and being aware of that it's a 20-minute presentation. Just in terms of structure, we quite like I always call it the news at 10 model. Give people the headlines about what you're going to talk about the detail, and then summarise it at the end. It just helps to refresh as a good piece of practice. Don't overcrowd your slides and make good use of relevant graphics. I know we all like things to be quite whizzy, but you don't want the whizziness of the slide deck to get in the way of what you're trying to share with the IEPA. Speak clearly, remember your audience, don't use internal jargon unless you've clarified it at the beginning, and don't just use from the slides, don't just read from the slides, because that's not really presentation skills. And again, I can't emphasize the importance of practicing. Okay, I'm going to leave these for you to read afterwards, but shall we do some quick questions? I'm conscious we're bang on 11 o'clock and we haven't covered anything for you, Maurice, yet. Maurice, do you want to record separately and we'll send this out separately?
Yeah, I think that would be better to give the detail that's needed.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that, Juicy. Not Maurice. Any couple of last questions, Joe, around best practice?
Okay, so let's have a look. So here's a good question, I think. Is there still a requirement for someone from the training provider and the employer to attend the presentation, which I'm assuming they're referring to the presentation with the endpoint assessor?
No, that's no longer in place. And that's on hold. So even the current one, that's no longer a requirement because of we've got dispensation to remove that at the moment because of COVID.
Thank you, Karen. And so what date is this assessment plan being used from? So if we can just reflect on the timescales, which I think you might have. So I think let's finish with that question. So on when will the assessment plan be implemented from?
Okay, so let's roll back to when they published, when IFAPE published this, which was on the 21st of October. So any learner who starts their apprenticeship, not the EPA, starts their apprenticeship on or after the 21st of October will be doing this new assessment plan. If they started their started their apprenticeship prior to that, then they can either continue with the new one and we won't be retiring, they can continue with the old one and we won't be retiring that until we really feel that everyone has gone through, or they can switch to the new one. And we covered that in the first webinar. So we are open for registrations for the new assessment plan from the 15th of January. And I don't think I've got a date in my head from when the first EPA can take place, because it's, you've got 12 weeks then to prepare the project implementation plan. I think that answers the question.
It does. Thank you, Karen. Absolutely. And I think it's worth kind of sharing what we're going to cover at webinar 3 and probably close with that, I would imagine.
Okay, so I'm going to, sorry, Juicy. So next steps is we have our third webinar on the 14th of December at 9:30. Please come and join us. Let us know when you book on. When you book onto the webinar, any questions that you have, and what we'll try and do is gather those questions, structure the webinar into something of logic, and do that webinar for you on the 14th of December. Okay, so this is how some further information that we've got, and this is how you can keep in touch with us. And thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to speaking with you on the 14th. Thank you now. Bye.